Casey Dinges, Executive Advisor for the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thanks for joining me today for part two of our discussion on how diverse teams drive civil engineering innovation. My guest today is Saki Urushidani, a professional engineer in the Environmental Services Department Water Quality Division for the City of Springfield, Missouri. Welcome, Saki.
Thank you for having me today.
Saki, research shows businesses are more successful and generate higher profit margins when they have diverse talent. Engineering impacts all people. It's critical that the profession reflects and integrates diverse perspectives and technical expertise to generate cutting-edge ideas. So how does having diverse teams enhance the civil engineering profession?
So when we talk about diversity, I think it's important to not only consider race, ethnicity, gender, which are typically what we talk about, but just all of the different lived experiences that we may have. And so with civil engineers, we're always designing or working on infrastructure that people interact with, everyone interacts with, or maybe even don't interact with. And so we need to think about different lived experiences. So whether it's socioeconomic status, different cultures, or different abilities, it's really important to think about all of those different life experiences that everyone could experience when we are thinking in terms of how we're designing something or implementing whatever infrastructure it is that we may have influence over. And so there are so many different lived experiences. So it's important for us to be comfortable with knowing that we don't know everyone's lived experiences, but being comfortable with asking people about different experiences that maybe we haven't been considering, and inviting people to invite their perspectives, because that way we can better design infrastructure for everybody.
You started to touch on this a little bit, but how does the diversity of civil engineering teams directly impact our communities?
So I think when we have homogenous teams, we come up with homogenous solutions, or solutions that we've just been doing, and that's just kind of the status quo, and maybe we aren't as adventurous or innovative to be able to think of solutions that haven't been done in the past. And we, unfortunately, everybody has their own biases based on their life experiences. And so we need to be comfortable with acknowledging that we have those biases, and those biases don't make us bad people per se, but acknowledging them and trying to get past those biases. So, for example, as someone who is, I use my right hand to write things, or if that's my dominant hand, I don't think about all the different struggles that people who are left-handed, who they have to face, whether it's, I don't know, doors that aren't designed for them, or a desk that's not designed for them, or maybe when they're writing, of the struggles of getting pen on their hand when they're writing, or just I don't even know what else that I don't think of on a regular basis when I interact with the things around me, that left-handed people may have difficulties with. And so even just with that example, I have to be comfortable with not knowing what I don't know, or just don't think about all the time. But just because I don't think about all of the different experiences, that doesn't make me a bad person. But if I am to design something, I would want to bring someone with that experience, or with that knowledge of, oh, well, these are some things to consider. And so that's not only for people with different dominant hand uses, but just any identity, any different lived experience that we have. So just being able to bring different people into the room, because we don't know what we don't know, right?
Good point. I guess you want to have as many biases as you can possibly have represented at the same time.
Right.
So in what ways do you think diversity can drive innovation forward?
So I think with having different perspectives in the room, you can come up with more creative solutions, because historically engineering has been pretty homogenous. And so maybe the solutions that have been come up with in the past, um, maybe the people haven't been in the room to be able to come up with different solutions. And so um, just being comfortable with having different people in the room, but also not only having the different voices in the room, but making sure that those voices feel included and comfortable and welcome, providing their input, providing their different perspectives. Because without inclusion, the diversity doesn't matter. You're not gonna. So if I don't feel comfortable giving my input, giving my lived experience or my experience that I had in a certain environment, there's no point in me being there if I don't feel comfortable or empowered to share my thoughts or ideas.
And so innovation can result from the diverse team. So, what are the biggest gaps in diversity and inclusion in the civil engineering workforce?
So I think the most obvious gaps would be race and gender, but I think um, we should look beyond that. But those two things are definitely important. But also thinking about people with different abilities, and then also people who grew up with different socioeconomic statuses. Um, One thing that I think about personally is marital status and how that affects work-life balance, what that means for different people. So, as someone who is not married and who lives alone and who is a homeowner, what that means for me in terms of like if I need to call the plumber and that interfering with my day of I don't have a partner who I can call to be at my house when the plumber's there. So just like different things in terms of how it influences our work life balance, and then also one thing that I don't think a lot of people talk about is whether or not people are introverts. So the differences between introverts and extroverts, and how I think American society favors extroverts a lot. And so, as an introverted person who sometimes has extroverted tendencies, I am becoming more comfortable speaking up during meetings, but that's taken me quite a long time to get there, right? And so, just figuring out how to be more inclusive of people who are introverts, who may be, I guess, maybe more shy or hesitant to speak up in a meeting, or maybe need more time to process a thought. And so I think just figuring out how to be more inclusive of different identities, all identities, is super important for the civil engineering workforce just in general. But then also just making sure that everyone feels like they belong. So in the workplace, making sure that your coworkers feel like they actually belong where they are, because that is a fundamental human need, is belonging. And so if your colleague maybe has different identities than you, making sure that they feel like they belong at the workplace with you.
Very interesting. Thanks. So what challenges does the profession face in attracting people of varying backgrounds and perspectives to the profession?
So I think right now it's pretty safe to say that civil engineering is pretty homogenous, which can be pretty intimidating for people who are not in the majority. So I think, like I said before, just we need to be more intentional about how to be more inclusive and welcoming for people who aren't in the majority, in whatever sense that may mean. And so I think something that's important too is not only um, being intentional in the workplace, but outside of the workplace too, in terms of if we're at a conference or a networking event, making sure that if you see someone who is in a minority, just being more welcoming to them. I recently went to a conference, I think back in June, where I had two very distinct instances where I was feeling very isolated, and I felt that um, so I was sitting at a table at lunch, and I was late to the table, but the gentleman sitting next to me, he was making conversation with everybody at the table except for me. And I was trying to think of like reasons that he wouldn't be engaging in conversation with me. Um, I don't think it was my age. I don't think it was my gender, because there was a younger woman who was sitting on the other side of him who he was having conversation with just fine. I was the only person of color at the table, and so I that was kind of what I landed on was why he wasn't interacting with me, because maybe he wasn't comfortable engaging with me. Maybe he didn't have experience talking to a person of color before. I don't know what it was, but it made me very uncomfortable and very unwelcomed. And so just things that may seem like a little thing, but all of those things can add up. And so um, just being mindful, and I mean, I don't think it ever hurts to just be nice and welcoming to other people, and being aware that your actions can impact people. So just being mindful of how you're treating other people, I think, is super important. That I think can be hard for people to kind of be mindful of, but I think that's a super important thing that we as a whole could be better about.
So what risks are posed if this doesn't change?
So I think if our profession stays homogenous, I think it definitely risks the community as a whole of not getting the best solutions for new challenges that we as a society face. Um, I think with the COVID pandemic, we would not, I mean, I don't think anyone knew that that would be happening then. And so who knows what new challenges we'll face in the future. And so the more different perspectives you have, I think the more better chance you have of coming up with better solutions.
Then how can practices and ideas produced by the varying perspectives of team members be better implemented?
So, like I said before, I think we need to just kind of acknowledge that we as individuals don't know everything, right? And so, um, I think we need to invite more people to the table, people who may have expertise in different areas, who just yeah, who can bring their different perspectives to the table. And listening to those people, not only just inviting them, but making sure that they have a voice, and also respecting that they might know more than you do. Um, and so um, I think that, yeah, needing to acknowledge that having a gap in knowledge doesn't make you lesser of a professional or a bad person, but just being open to learning about how um, different people have different lived experiences. Um, yeah.
So how else can teams benefit from having a more diverse representation, whether it be the workflow or overall work culture?
So I think there can be instances where having different perspectives could possibly prevent you from building infrastructure that um, may not be utilized as much as the team originally thinks that it would be utilized. Maybe there's factors that they didn't think about, or maybe they think that they're thinking in the best interest of a certain community, but maybe they didn't actually engage the community that they're trying to reach. Um, so, or maybe it could prevent infrastructure from being used in a different way than it was intended to be used. So, an example I can think about is one group was talking about dog parks, building a dog park as part of a project. And I was invited to one of the meetings where um, I started asking questions of like, okay, well, have we considered this? And so thinking directly about water quality impacts of dog parks, I raised the question of, have we thought of this as a water quality, a negative to water quality? Because from my experience being at dog parks, people don't always pick up after their pets. I know ideally people would, and there are pet waste dispensers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the reality. And the group, they just all assumed that everybody picked up after their dogs and that it wouldn't impact water quality negatively. And so I mean, that was one of the reasons that I stopped going to one of our dog parks, was because my dog kept finding the pet waste that wasn't picked up. And so,
And we know what dogs like to do with that.
yeah, exactly. So like, had I not been in that meeting, people might have just moved on and said, okay, yeah, everything's going to be fine. And so, I mean, just little things like that they just assumed. And so it's best to ask questions, and not assume things, and just bring different people to the table that have lived through different things. And so, yeah, so I guess one other thing in terms of work culture, so making sure that, so if your work group is diverse, and those people have stayed there for a while, then that probably signals to potential new employees that that's an inclusive environment, right? And so I think having diversity invites diversity. And then also in terms of having a diverse workforce, that shows and signals to future engineers that they can also be engineers. And so then that just invites diversity.
Good point. What needs to be done to ensure continued and significant DEI growth for the future of the profession?
So I think we really need to educate our current workforce about the importance of diversity and inclusion, because if our current workforce isn't going to be more inclusive and diverse, then we're not going to retain the diversity in the workforce. And so then it'll just be this cycle of just homogenous groups. And so I think we need to be more intentional about working with the current workforce about how to be more inclusive, and teaching people that it's okay to be different, and we should be talking about our differences. And by not talking about our differences, that makes people feel excluded. And so I think, yeah, so both in our technical work and employees, thinking about our employees, I think, yeah, it's definitely important to educate people in terms of how to think about different lived experiences and be more welcoming.
Saki, thank you so much for joining me today for this important discussion on growing diversity in the civil engineering workforce.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more information on ASCE's Interchange series, visit asce.org/interchange. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.